Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 14th talk in the University of Buckingham Great Minds series. And tonight I am absolutely thrilled to have Kate Fall talking to us, who was at the very, very heart of one of the most important post-war premierships, that of David Cameron, on which history turned. History turned in Scotland, it turned with a coalition government, and it turned with Brexit and with other areas too. And Kate had an inside window on that as the Deputy Chief of Staff. He's also written a brilliant book, the best book, I believe, to have been written about Number 10 by a woman, and indeed perhaps quite possibly the best by any staff member. Here it is, Gatekeeper by Kate Fall, available from all fine bookshops and elsewhere. Now, welcome in particular if you're new to this series. We run it in association with the Buckingham Literary Festival, and we have often 1,000 and more people from across the county and way beyond the county listening in. Do have questions, and questions, it's easier if they're brief and if you put your own name there with the question. And there are going to be three elements tonight. Kate is going to begin talking first, and then secondly I'm going to be looking at some images from the book, photographs with her, and talking a little bit more about her life, and then thirdly, and the lion's share of the evening, is over to you. But Kate, tell us about your story, and what was it really like going each morning into Number 10 Downing Street, or going around the world? What's it like working with the Prime Minister? What's it like working with that team? How did you manage your own family life and friends in that 6-year period? Over to you, Kate, and thank you for being on our series.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here. And I think I'll just jump in by starting by saying nothing prepares you for the moment in which you realise one morning that your office is Number 10 Downing Street, and you walk up that street and you're photographed by the bank outside, and you knock on that door and you're let in, and that's the beginning of a whole new world. So that really is one of the most exciting moments, certainly in my life so far. But going back going back a bit, I mean, I spent 11 years working for David Cameron as one of his close advisors. 11 years saw my children go from 3 and 6 to 14 and 17. So they claim that I've taken their childhood, or certainly politicized it. That's a massive, massive project. And I think if you think about who came after me, my successors, Nick and Fee, lasted 11 months. And so far we've had this government and the likes of Dominic Cummings, who was another of my successors, for just 11 months. So I think that just gives you a sense of how long a stint I did, for good or less. And you will have to, you know, make a decision about that later this evening. So a really big chunk in time. I wanted to talk to you a little bit, start by just talking through the journey that was sort of Project Cameron. And I want to take you right back to when it all began, which was sort of 2005. Now, some of you were probably in school and not at all interested in politics and can't remember very much from that era. And I think the best way to describe it for people of that age is to say, if you think about right now how long we've had a Conservative government of some sort for, this was like that, but in reverse. The Tories had lost 3 elections in a row. There was a sense that the party was talking to itself. They talked about, you know, immigration, tax cuts, tough on crime. They talked all the time about Europe. And here we had a very successful Labour administration who were very adept communicators, whatever you thought about that time. And we just kept on losing. And along came an MP who'd only been in Parliament for 4 or 5 years. And when a leadership election was called, he threw his hat in the ring. And it was seen to be pretty audacious. And he was not the front runner by any means. In fact, he looked like he was going to crash and burn. And we started to, try and engage in the leadership election. And we went up to the party conference in 2005 with only 14 supporters. So David used to say later to me, you could fit them in one cab. And at this conference, he got up and made a speech where he basically said those things. We have got to talk to people about what they care about education, about their families, about social responsibility, about all this stuff, and stop talking to ourselves. And there was a moment, and I remember it so well, I was sitting in the front row, and he looked at the audience and said, "Come with me." Incredibly powerful gesture from a politician, and it was fresh and it wasn't behind a podium. And they thought, yes, let's come with you. Let's give it a go. So he became leader of the opposition, and I went to work for him in those wonderful offices over the far side of Westminster in Parliament, which overlooked the river and a sort of beautiful corner of the parliamentary estate. And that was the beginning of a 5-year period in opposition. And when I look at Keir Starmer today, I'm fascinated to watch how he's taken to his position and the actually adept way in which he's not being too critical of the government, but nudging them when they're putting the needle in just enough but not too much. This was us back then. We were trying to make a name for ourselves. We were trying to bring up issues, but most of all, we were trying to change the party. So we talked a lot about social responsibility. We were the first major sort of Western party to talk about green issues. There was, Huskies and Hug a Hoodie and all this sort of thing. The next thing that happened was all of that suddenly changed overnight because the world economy crashed, and no one wanted to hear what we had to say about all those important social issues. They just cared about what was going on, quite rightly, with all these global economies, the banks falling. It was a terrifying moment. And overnight, our sort of Cameron won, the whole first sort of plan and what we stood for, and the platform on which we'd sort of sold the Cameron message to was in a way over or mothballed, and we'll come back to that when it came back again a bit later. But it's very relevant today, all this, because if you think about Boris Johnson, we think, at least I think of Boris as being a Brexit leader, somebody who I always thought would be defined by Brexit. And, he stood on that platform. He's become leader of the party and leader of our country on Brexit. But actually, he's now wrapped up and will most likely be judged by this issue that none of us could have predicted. And that is one of the very, very fascinating and peculiar things about politics. You never know. And I mean, Anthony Teldermega, a historian, will know this better than all of us. You don't know how you're going to be judged by history and on what you're going to be judged by history. So moving on, we found ourselves in a 2010 campaign. We'd made it through 5 years of opposition. We'd had our ups and downs and lots of them. And of course, all elections really come down to one main question, which is, do you want change or can you not afford change? And I think if you actually think about elections, however way they dress it up, that tends to be the question. And at this time, we'd had 13 years of Labour. Of course, we had a new leader in Gordon Brown, but Gordon was, a fascinating character, a very formidable chancellor, slightly less suited, in my opinion, to the role of Premier, a bit Shakespearean and moody and possibly wasn't quite right for the role. So everything was going pretty well. We were ahead in the polls, not massively, but we looked like we were doing really well. And this brings you onto a point about elections and campaigns, massively unpredictable. In the middle of it, we were the first campaign in British election history who had to deal with TV debates. And that was a bit like saying we're fighting a war with horses and suddenly finding yourself up against a tank. It's X Factor elections, it's reality TV, he did well last night, I love him. You know, everything changes overnight. And I had the unpleasant experience of sitting in the green room in Manchester in the first night of the first debate, sitting with Samantha, David's wife, watching The Worm, which was a sort of reality public opinion about what they thought of Dave, going down and down and down, while The Worm was going up for Nick Clegg. And overnight, the whole premise of the election completely changed. Anyway, fortunately, like many other reality TV, people change their mind again towards the end of the election. So elections are formidable things, and maybe we'll talk a bit about that later, but part of it is just keeping sane. I mean, you're out on the road all day, you're dealing with lots of difficult issues, you're doing it all on your BlackBerry, you're trying to sort of not feel ill on the helicopter or the train. And I remember once losing a shoe under the train on the platform, and I didn't have a spare pair, and I was literally sort of hopping onto the train, and you realize that, you know, just a very basic thing, always have a spare pair of shoes is one of them. But that's just some of the many disastrous things that can go wrong when you're on these campaign trails. So fast forward, we don't quite win the election, but I think I'd like to just, of course, I'm party pre here, but the election in 2010 was a very, very special election for the Conservatives, because David Cameron won 97 new MPs. I think people often forget, because they go, oh, we didn't win, you went into coalition, but it was a massive, massive victory. It turned years of Labour overnight into, you know, the Conservatives were back in the seat of power. Yes, they were sharing it with, but it was a massive turnaround, and you know, the country woke up in a different mood, in a different place than it had the night before. And that was a very, very big success for David Cameron and our team. And I say particularly David, because elections and politics are often, you know, about the leader. They do bear the brunt. There is that sense of the loneliness, and in a way the responsibility of an election does fall on the shoulders of the Premier. So, but we were 20 seats short of governing. So we were in the middle of this incredibly difficult time. The country was, the economy was in very bad shape. It was the worst recession since the war. We had a huge deficit, the biggest in the Western world. And I remember the morning I woke up after, well, I had 1 hour sleep after the election, and the images of Greece, you know, the riots in the streets in Greece, and the you know, shortages in food and everything. And you just think, that could be us if we don't get this right. So day one in number 10, as I said to you before, you know, you walk up that road and you think, I'm working here, but then actually you walk in and go, well, I don't know number 10. I've never been here before. I don't know where my office is. And I remember the night before, I talked to George Osborne about it, and he said to me, my one piece of advice is power and proximity go together. The nearer you are to power, the better. So being one of David's closest advisors, I was going to anyway be in the office just outside his. And when I walked in, I saw there was an empty desk outside his door, and I decided if anyone was going to sit there, it had to be me. So I put my bag down and I sat there for 6 years. So what was my role then? People often say, what was your role? And it's hard to describe that, because a role is sort of, when you look at the people who are in Downing Street now, you know, was I the same as Dom Cummings? Yes and no. I mean, Dominic Cummings, in a way, takes more of the power in himself than we did. Our number 10 was more collegiate. There was me, there was Ed Llewellyn, who was the chief of staff, you know, the head of comms. We were, and George Osborne was a key part of our inner team. But I would say my role was like the CEO of an organization. I was also a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, and because I knew him well, I also did tell him what I thought. I tended to brief him always before a meeting and always after, and I went to nearly every single meeting with him. But I also had a role as gatekeeper, which is why I chose that title for my book. Because I feel the role of gatekeeper is a very important one. It's about the priority of how the Prime Minister spends his or her time, the issues that matter most that week, and it's about who's in the room to make those key decisions. Two incredibly important things. And then I'd add another thing as well, which is about the atmosphere of the number 10. You know, are you a bunker? Well, all number 10s are bunkers, but some are more so than others. You know, do you see the MPs? Is there an open door policy? Are people with other views allowed in the room? You know, that's very important. You want to open the door and you want to know when to shut it. And those decisions are decisions for the gatekeeper. People often say, oh, the inner circle around the Prime Minister, and normally quite disparagingly. I mean, what I would say to that is there's always an inner circle around a Prime Minister. There was always an inner circle around a king or queen. You know, Thomas Cromwell was a spad. And I think that they can work against you if you're too insular and you don't listen. But on the whole, there's a momentum and there's a trust in an inner circle, which means you should be able to shut the door and really argue a point or an important issue and know you're not going to read about it in the Sunday Times. And that is so important. And that was, I think, one of the things I'm most proud of about my time at Number 10. I felt we didn't, you know, things weren't leaked into the weekend papers. We had many, many discussions and disagreements. We knew we trusted each other to have. So very important part of what I did. How am I doing for time, Anthony?
Fine. Just another few minutes and,
Okay.
and then.
Okay, and then we'll go into questions. I might leave the sort of policy side then to pick up with Anthony, because, you know, obviously, you know, we worked very hard at our time in Number 10 to fix the economy, and we started conversations and reform programs over, you know, schools and welfare and immigration, and, you know, 0.7% we stood by the world's poor, and we introduced gay marriage and all sorts of things. And of course, Europe at the end was something we tried to resolve, and it also was the end of our time there. And I'm sure people will want to talk about that and come back to that later. But maybe we'll just pop onto some more thematic points just to draw to a close. You know, it's a tough game, politics. We thought we were near to being able to win and choose our time of leaving, and instead we crashed into a wall in the worst possible way. It was very distressing, and it was not just for us, that's the least of it. What happened in the aftermath, the divisive era that followed us, was a huge regret to me personally, and I know to my team. I've learned over the years that politics and friendship, people warned me that they didn't always go together. I thought our group of friends and advisors will be different, but politics does put pressure on friendship. It does make you choose between ambition, ideology, loyalty. My time, I was a mum at Number 10. I was a single mum for the 6 years there. It was difficult balancing all those things. I had very little time for anything really but my work and trying to be a decent mum, and that's difficult. And that also, women in politics, I think, is still an issue, partly because of some of those issues. I mean, of course, men have those issues absolutely too, but I think it's true that, you know, I was one of the few women, senior women in Number 10, and a voice in the room. I still think that there are issues around that. I still think politics is quite a male culture. I think it's important to have a balance, and we try to make a difference there, and we should have done better and more, as we should have done across, you know, diversity as a whole. So there were lots of things I wish I'd done. I would say that I'm proud of having a decent team who tried our best to do the things for the long-term good of our country. And I wrote this book because I wanted to share some of that with all of you, and to give an insight into what it feels like not to be the Premier, but to be somebody in the back of house, and a woman in Number 10.
Well, Kate, thank you very much indeed for that excellent introduction, which has taken the first 20 minutes of this. Welcome to all of you who've joined while Kate was talking. This is the 14th in the University of Buckingham's Great Mind series. Do have the questions coming. I'd love to take as many questions of yours as I can, and do put your name on the question. And we're going to now turn to the second section. I'm going to be asking Kate about some photographs which appear from her book, The Gatekeeper. And the first one, Kate, is coming up, I hope, on everyone's screens now, and is a picture of you with David Cameron and George Osborne. Can you tell us about that? Yes,
so I like that picture just because it David Cameron and George Osborne were my colleagues, and they also are friends of mine. I met them through politics, but David was actually in the year above me at Oxford, and it was taken early on in our time together at Davos, and people will have their own views about what they think of Davos. But for politicians, it's quite a useful meeting because you can go and meet lots of heads of state and make a speech. It's a platform, and meet the aid community are all there. And so we used to go every year and have a fondue one night as well. So a little bit of a nice time as well.
And is the reason why prime ministers tend to appoint people they've known going all the way back to university, sometimes even before, as was the case, for example, with Tony Blair and Angie Hunter, who was your equivalent under Tony Blair as the senior woman, because they feel they can absolutely trust people they've known for 20, 25 years, and trust is at a premium?
I think the trusting is hugely important, but the David Cameron group it was more a group of people who met because of politics. We actually all met working at Conservative Research Department, and there were strong friendships, but it was also a sort of a political philosophy that bound us. And lots of the people who worked for us later didn't know David from far. But it is absolutely true that trust is highly rated and important in politics.
And the next photograph, which I hope is coming up on the screen now, is a photograph, I hope everyone can see that, of you on a train. What's happening there, Kate?
David and I used to travel a lot around the country, and actually it was one of the things I thought was such a privilege of the job, in that you go everywhere, you meet so many people, they tell you about what they do, what they're worried about. David was always he was very, very good at that. He loved, meeting people and trying to help and talking to them. But it was also quite highly pressurized because things could go wrong. So, in a campaign, sometimes, we had a chicken once sent to stalk us on a campaign sent by the Mirror to ask questions of David, for example. So every time David tried to have a conversation with someone, the Mirror chicken would come. But so I was on the train then prepping ahead of the meeting and making sure he knew what he was going to say, going through the speech. So it was great, but quite pressurized.
And we can't see security always surrounding the Prime Minister?
So on the train, David and I would sit there working, but his security team would be literally just across from that table, and various other people. I mean, it wouldn't have just been me and David. It would have been a private secretary from number 10. There would be the ops people, both with us, but also the forward party is what the Americans call them, a press officer, and somebody would meet us as well. So it's a big operation, and it gets bigger when you have a prime minister because you need to have the security people as well.
And he has 3 gadgets there, phones. Looks like a BlackBerry, an iPhone, and an old style Nokia. I hope everyone at home can see that. What's going on there with this technology?
Well, basically, at number 10, you can't use your personal phone, which you use with your friends. You're given a high security old-fashioned BlackBerry. So we always used to have both. And I think that works quite well because that's my daughter ringing in on that line, and that's work ringing on the other one. And we all used to use those Nokia phones quite a lot, especially on if you do a foreign trip from number 10, they'll give you an old-fashioned Nokia. They're extremely useful because they're very hard to tap an old-fashioned Nokia. So yes, we used to use those a bit.
And tell us about how people would always be listening in on the team when the Prime Minister is talking. And does the Prime Minister have any confidential conversations where he doesn't have people listening in, taking notes?
I think the answer to that is not, because the Prime Minister, if he's doing a call which is in any way an official call, that it is always minuted. It is government business and it is minuted. So the calls officially put in for the Prime Minister, normally there would be a private secretary listening and taking a minute of the discussion, and sometimes really quite a few people. They call it patching in the business. So, and sometimes you get in. I used to get in a muddle because there were so many calls on the weekend. Some were patched in when, of course, you couldn't enter the conversation, and other times you were actually part of the conversation. And there were times when I was saying no, 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 and realised no one was listening at all. So, can be quite challenging.
And every minute of a Prime Minister's day accounted for in advance.
Yes, absolutely. And not just that, but any minute of the Prime Minister's day outside either Chequers, which is the retreat for the Prime Minister, or actually in number 10. Anything outside that bubble has been recce'd by the security. They know where they're going, they know what time, they've been there before. So that you just cannot do things on a whim when you're Prime Minister. You can walk from one bit of number 10 to the other on a whim, but you can't do anything very more exciting than that.
And did you or he ever worry about security?
You do worry about that side of things, although you sort of get used to it. But I think what it does mean, it does mean you have to plan ahead. Sometimes it was pretty frustrating if you're working for a Prime Minister, because you're sort of you're trying to get in the morning, and say there was a lockdown for a security reason. David, on a number of occasions, ringing me saying, "Where are you? You know, we're supposed to be at this meeting." And I'm like, "Well, I'm actually outside. There's a lockdown." So he didn't always realise how frustrating that could be.
And next photograph. And here we have, what are we looking at here, Kate?
I can't see the photograph, so you're going to have to.
Kate, this is the photograph of the Prime Minister in his den at in number 10, with Jeremy Hayward on his right, and Ed Llewellyn on his left, our right.
And quite a few other people.
And about 10 people, and you're sitting opposite him, biting your finger.
Well, that was a classic. So in number 10, we had a morning meeting at 8:30 and an afternoon meeting at 4, where we really took key decisions of on the day, and also sometimes discuss more strategic issues. I mean, at number 10, you have to firefight 24/7. You have to govern the country, and you have to strategize, and you have to do all those three things in one go. And you often need the same people in the meetings to help those things along. So we developed these meetings, and they were the critical meetings of the day. And I used to sit in that seat because I could see David Cameron and I could see George Osborne, and I used to do the agenda, so I could sort of make faces at them and talk to the agenda.
And exactly halfway between you and the Prime Minister is Simon Case, who was brought in 2 weeks ago to try and sort out number 10. Next photograph. And this is of you and David Cameron in the den in number 10. And he's looking at what looks like his timetable for the day. And he's looking rather sceptical, Kate.
Yeah, well, he probably looked at the day and thought it was the most ghastly. He would say, "Dentist diary, what are you trying to do? You're trying to kill me today." And I think that was quite early on in Downing Street. So he's just getting used to the sort of hugely challenging day. I mean, a Prime Minister's diary is non-stop. He would get up at 5:30, do his box, go for a run, come down.
Do his box, Kate.
Sorry, so Prime Ministers have their work, like their homework, papers to read, policy to sign off. security papers in a special file with coloured papers, a whole range of very important papers, and they're put in what's called a box, which is red they're very heavy, the boxes. So when you're travelling with the Prime Minister, it's quite, it's quite annoying actually. And these boxes go upstairs with the Prime Minister.
And the next photograph is of you sitting around, and I think this is this general election day in 2015? You're all looking rather glum. There's Craig Oliver on the left in what looks like an RAF jacket, and you're at the French windows.
So that was election day 2015, and election days are very, very strange and tense days because there's nothing you can actually do on polling day. You have to just sit and wait. We used to plan, make plans for what we would do, what our first 40 days plans were, and who would be in the cabinet. That day, we were not absolutely convinced we were going to win. So we were going through all the numbers, and that picture was taken. We were actually drafting. We had one speech for if it all went well and another speech for if it didn't go so well. And the picture was taken when David was reading out the if it didn't go so well draft.
And you have Liz Sugg sitting down, looking very, very glum, looking with her hand on her fist. Just tell us what Liz Sugg did.
So Liz Sugg is an amazing woman. She was head of operations for Number 10, which is an extremely challenging job. I mean, she really did run. Every time David walked out the door, she was in charge. She was in charge of where he went, what time he got there, the pictures, which are so important in politics. I mean, Liz would never have let David not know what he was doing, whether he was standing, sitting, the sign behind him when he made the speech, all the visuals and the people he meets, and that they know what they're going to ask or talk to them before and said what's on your mind, and all that prep is so vital for a prime ministerial team, and she was really amazing at it.
And in between you and Liz Sugg is Ed Llewellyn, now British ambassador in Paris. Just say what Ed did.
So Ed was the chief of staff, and he and I really boxed and coxed. So we divided a lot of the work in Number 10. Ed really is a fantastic person, and he was particularly brilliant on the security brief. I'd say it's the number, and a prime minister spends nearly 50% of their time on the wider security brief. That's homeland security, as the Americans would call it, and overseas issues. It's a huge amount of their job and huge pressure, because anything that involves lives and sending troops into difficult places, police issues, all of that. So Ed and I divided up the work. I hugely respect him. He's a fantastic ambassador, and yeah, it was my great privilege to do that job with him.
And was it a bit like Life in Spooks, the television series, for those who saw it, or with Bodyguard, with constant fear of plots against the country, or is that all highly dramatized?
No, I think well, a bit dramatized, but there's no doubt about it that there is that continual worry that something's going to go wrong on your watch, and things do go wrong on your watch. And one of the things that is important, and you realise so strongly when you're in that situation, is there's not always a perfect answer, and there's certainly not an answer where there's no cost. So you see this very clearly with the sort of dilemmas that the Boris administration have had when they've had lives and livelihoods, and actually livelihoods stroke lives on the sort of whole COVID debate. And in our time, lots of things, came up that we didn't expect. Libya, Syria, Sarah, you yourself wrote about the episode, all sorts of things, and intelligence problems, and which I can't obviously mention.
On to the next slide here. And now here, Kate, we have you and Gabby Burton. Is that Prague with a rather Eastern style military guard?
Yes. So that was a set of trips that David was doing bilaterally trying to roll the pitch for the European negotiation. And actually, Gabby Burton, who was David's press secretary and a very talented, charming woman, she and I slightly messed up that day because we didn't actually know coming off the flight whether we were supposed to walk around the side of the guard or go down the red carpet. And the reason why we're laughing is because halfway down we decided that probably we shouldn't have gone down the red carpet.
And tell us about, where does the Prime Minister fly from, and how does the Prime Minister get to, explain about Northolt and how the Prime Minister gets to Northolt quickly and above all safely?
So Northolt, which is just outside in West London, is a military airport, and the Prime Ministers do use that a lot. It's obviously very convenient. You wouldn't take, I suppose you wouldn't take a huge flight from there, but often the Prime Minister uses what's called the Queen's flight, which are the smaller flights that the Queen has. Obviously, she has priority, and it's just a very efficient way, especially to flying around Europe. And if you're in a hurry and you've got to get somewhere quickly, the Prime Ministers can use bikes. I mean, David didn't like using the bikes too much. He thought it just looked a bit entitled and annoyed people getting stuck in it. You know, oh, there's the Prime Minister and I'm in a traffic jam. Sometimes when the security went up, you had to have the bikes.
And the bikes did what, Kate?
And they basically go by the Prime Minister at the front and at the back and at the side, and they offer protection from, I mean, we saw just this week this thing with Boris where somebody, I don't think meant to, but crashed and the cars crashed.
So always that security, and then 2 or 3 more photographs coming through. And the next photograph now is of you standing over his shoulder, and you've got looks like George Osborne looking down at a document, not certain.
That was
black and white.
That's actually an interesting moment in time, which is why I picked it, because it was actually when David decided that night of the 2010 election, when we were 20 seats short of winning, instead of trying to form a minority government, he felt that couldn't make the big decisions that the country needed at the time, to make a big, bold offer for a coalition with the Lib Dems.
And the next photograph. Amazing how photographs capture moments in history. And there is you, photograph of you looking rather fondly at President Obama. And then in the middle there is Kim Darroch, who was the British ambassador to Paris till he fell out with Donald Trump. What's happening there? Where are you?
So, I mean, this is one of the great pride and joy, this photograph for me, because I am a huge admirer of Barack Obama. He organised a sort of state visit for David and Samantha in 2012, and we all went out, and there was a banquet that night, which was a huge honour to go to. And it was wonderful to be there. I'm half American, so it meant, particularly meant a lot to me. I would just say, though, like often in politics, the high moments are swiftly followed by difficult moments, because that photo also marked the end of a good period and the beginning of a difficult period, which went from the so-called pasty budget into sort of omnishambles and a summer of difficulty and falling polls and all that sort of thing. So it was a high watermark. And
the final photograph is of you walking down the steps, Liz Sugg, then the PM, then you, then Ed Llewellyn. What's happening there?
That was my last day in Downing Street. So a sad final day, and David had just talked to the staff at Number 10 and thanked them for all that they'd done and for the support they'd given him. And I was coming back down the stairs. He'd given that talk upstairs in the state rooms, and all we had really left to do was sit and have a chat before the final goodbye, which was a very moving moment when the Prime Minister and his wife Samantha were clapped out by the staff who'd served him for 6 years, and then he went and said his goodbye at the front of Number 10, drove off to take leave of the Queen.
What are you feeling at that moment? It's hard to read from your face. I hope, by the way, everyone can see it on the full screen.
It was A huge emotion that final day. It was a surprise as well. I mean, the whole thing was a surprise, but after we lost the referendum and David resigned, I mean, we had thought we had four more years in number 10, because David had said he wasn't going to stand again. Then we thought we'd have about 4 more months. And then we ended up with sort of 4 days, because if you remember, Andrea Leadsom pulled out of the leadership election, leaving Theresa May as the last standing candidate. And David said, right, that's I'm off. I'm going to go after PMQs on Wednesday. So we had literally 2 days to wrap everything up and prepare to leave and say our goodbyes, prepare for the last PMQs, have the last cabinet, and we'd done cabinet and PMQs, and then this was the final before. After that, we went into the Prime Minister's den, me, David, Ed, and chatted away for 10-15 minutes with Samantha until Liz said, it's time for you to go. And Ed and I went ahead down the famous corridor number 10, saying goodbye to the people we'd worked with for 6 years, very emotional, and then went outside to wave David and the family away.
And such a historic photograph. And for those who don't know, that's the main staircase in number 10 with the photographs of all the prime ministers. And there you can see David Cameron. And now he is one of those images on that, because each time a prime minister goes, all the photographs are shuttled down. You can see from Clement Attlee on the left, Neville Chamberlain below, up to John Major just behind you and above your head, Kate. So we're now going to move into the last section of this, which is to have questions. And we have an enormous number of questions. We're going to begin with one from Chris, who says, what is the most difficult thing about having a non-elected advisor for a political leader, Kate?
I think the non-elected advisors, their power comes from their boss. That is the thing you have to remember. And therefore, I believe there needs to be a degree of humility about your role, because you're not elected. But I think it also means that your service is to the Prime Minister and to your country. And you're not actually looking both ways. You're not looking, oh, my constituency or my own political career. So when it works well, I think it's hugely beneficial. I think when it doesn't work so well is when, possibly people get a bit too high profile, or they become the story, and then it's a bit of a distraction.
And Josh asked a question about China and the enthusiasm that both David Cameron and George Osborne had for a very close relationship with China. Does that seem like a mistake now we've seen how China can be over Australia, Hong Kong, etc.?
Well, it's a very good, very topical question, that. I mean, I don't think it was a mistake, in the sense that we're a trading country, and our interest in jobs and prosperity for our country means we want to trade with people, including China. But is it right to say, do we have some concerns? Should we look at security issues and how much infrastructure the Chinese should own and what infrastructure they should own, and issues around intellectual property? Absolutely. So I think you have to weigh it up, and I think you need to have your eyes wide open and continue your relationship like that.
Ben is asking about the Scottish referendum, and can you talk about that evening? And about David Cameron going to bed and not sleeping. But he's also asking, Ben's asking in particular, would the Scottish referendum have been easier if Gordon Brown had named it the Bank of Britain rather than the Bank of England?
Well, I think you make a very good point there. Look, the minute that the SNP won those Scottish elections in 2011, the referendum was on the cards. So we then try to lean into that and have some sort of control over, the question and the timing, which is why we then announced that we would have a Scottish referendum. And the polls had us 10 points ahead for the entire time, until, of course, as you will remember, in the summer, when the polls over the weekend went the other way. And it was a particularly worrying moment, especially for David, who was staying in Balmoral. at the time. And I remember opening my Sunday Times and thinking of him opening his and thinking that that can't have been a very happy moment. But obviously it was, you know, we care, I mean, I care deeply about the union, and the idea that we wouldn't be with our Scottish relatives was a very tense one. And I must say that was a particularly tense evening, and we kept on hearing the turnout was low, then it was high. We didn't even know what that meant. I myself stayed the most uncomfortable night of my life on the rather sort of puffy purple sofa in the study of the Chancellor, George Osborne, because we all had to stay there in case, you know, the result went the wrong way. And I'd failed to get myself a sleeping bag in before. So yes, a very tense and uncomfortable night.
And what would he have done, Kate, had it been 55-45 the other way round?
I think he would have considered resigning. I think it would have been pretty hard to stop him. I think he would be absolutely humiliated that he had been the person who, David Cameron, the very name itself just shows, you know, cared so much. And he, you know, David, I think it's important though just to reflect on why he lent into that, because his idea of leadership was to confront the big issues. He was not someone who wanted to dodge issues and just leave them to the next person, consolidate power, stay there as long as possible. He believed in the power and the wisdom of the people who he was governing, and he believed that you should have a grown-up conversation about the big issues that were really worrying you. And if you push difficult issues under the carpet and hide them, political issues, they tend to come back and in a way add to the grievance culture. So it was, yeah, a first taste of what was to come, maybe.
Wayne is asking, was there a conscious strategy to lose the referendum? I think that's the 2016 referendum. And did the PM ever forgive the events of the ERM and all the things that have gone wrong with the EU? How does he feel about it now?
Well, I think, you know, huge regret that we lost. A sense of a bit more of a sense of closure that the election last year that Boris won with such a large majority, there is a sense of the country feeling we've made a decision and we're moving on, and we now all hope it's a success. For all of you, especially, and I have children who are at university about to go, you know, your future, we've got to make this a success. But, you know, our relationship with Europe always had issues. We had created a place for us in Europe, which was very special. You know, we were not in the Eurozone, we weren't in Schengen. You know, we were good at carving out the best and leaving the bits that didn't suit us. And that was, in our view, a very good thing. But I think it became difficult when the Eurozone countries were under pressure and they moved to shore up their currency. And in a way, we became more the odd one out, not less. And that definitely exacerbated the situation and led towards, you know, the referendum and trying to renew our mandate.
Anna asks, what are your thoughts about the lack of diversity amongst Number 10 staff, and how can we move forward so that it truly represents society, given the very issue that we spoke about the PM wanting to have trusted people around them?
Well, it's a very, very good question. I mean, I think we tried, but we could have tried harder. And actually, I've come to the view now that part of the problem was you pick in a hurry new people, normally because they're always in a crisis, from a pool from Conservative Research Department. Who's your best researcher that day? And we should do now, and should have done more then, to go out and find those people, to have a more diverse pool to begin with. We did improve the numbers of women in Parliament, which was embarrassingly sort of 13 women when I began in politics, which was, compared to Labour's 101 at some point, absolutely ridiculous, and more BAME people in Parliament as well. But we have so much further to go, and I think we should be way more proactive. And I would have thought headhunting, really talking to people in universities now, encouraging them, mentoring, way more proactive.
Bill asks, politicians are very good at winning elections, Kate, but they're not so good at managing and particularly reference to COVID at the moment, with the cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister having to rely very much on the officials, the scientists, the medics for the expert advice and managerial competence. Does that matter that the ministers, the politicians, aren't better managers?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I think that's a particular point for this team, because this team are very good at winning campaigns. I mean, better
the Boris
than,
Johnson team.
Yeah. I mean, they're better than my team. Although I was proud of all the elections I won. You know, they won the referendum against the odds. They won the huge majority in December. But the one thing they haven't done very much of is actually governing, is actually running a day-to-day office where you have to think about all sorts of different things. And I think that they've come in the deep end. And COVID is, of course, hugely challenging and difficult. And I know, I can only just imagine the sort of pressure they're under. So I think it is difficult. But at the end, you do want to gather your minds and you do want to listen to experts, but you still have to make political judgment.
Maria says, if you hadn't met David Cameron at Oxford, do you think things might have been different for him? And what would you have done instead?
That's a very good question. I mean, I didn't work for David really because I met him at Oxford. I really caught up with him later through politics. But if I hadn't ended up working for David, I mean, I really think it's an excellent question, which I shall consider. What would my life have been? I've worked in politics anyway for quite a long time. I'd worked for Michael Howard in his office for a while, but perhaps I would have never had the amazing opportunities and roller coaster ride that I had. And who knows, I could have had a whole other career.
Which would have been what? I'm going to pin you down.
Well, I trained as a musician when I was younger, so maybe I would have gone back to that. But no, I think I would have done something political. My father was a diplomat. I never quite had the languages for that. So
tell us about growing up in Moscow when you were a teenager, I think. But by then, your father was ambassador from 1992 to 1995, Sir Brian Fall, and we were hearing from yesterday's speaker, John Campner, about being in Moscow at that amazing time. How did that influence you, and why didn't you become a diplomat?
Well, it hugely influenced me. I mean, I think the sense of, public service is very ingrained. It was fascinating upbringing. We moved around a lot, so also there were downsides. There's a loneliness and a sense of where's home. But I lived in Russia as a child as well, under Brezhnev in the Cold War years, and just the insight into the greyness and the difficulties of that time has stayed with me forever. And yes, it has hugely influenced me, but I might have tried to go into the Foreign Office. I never had the languages. My father's a really good linguist, and for some reason I was good at music and bad at languages, so it might have had to be the Treasury instead. So
Raymond says, being in Downing Street for 6 years, Kate, must be a very strange, socially isolating experience for you and for the PM. How did you ensure that David Cameron continued to understand the social intangibles, the lives of MPs, the party, what people beyond Westminster were living? I mean, it's such an unreal life, being surrounded all the time by security and high-pressured staff.
Well, it's a very good question, that, and I think it really gets to the crux of what I was trying to say earlier about the bunker mentality. I mean, in a sense, you can't get away from that because you are stuck with a security profile and you can't do things on a whim. But always very important for the Prime Minister to get out. Most Fridays he would either go to the constituency or go on a tour, a regional tour somewhere in Britain, meet people, sit and have a coffee in a cafe. Of course, they knew he was coming, but you're still listening to what people have to say. Also, very important to, in our day, we always let the MPs come and talk to David if they asked, or very important to keep in touch with the parliamentary party. They might not always like you, but you still need to be talking to them. But also, we used to try and have brainstorming sessions, and include people who had different views from academia on the big issues. You know, when we were first there, I remember one of the first weekends, you know, David had a whole summit on Afghanistan, asking lots of different views, you know, should we stay, should we go, what should we do? So it is difficult to get right. I'm not saying we were perfect, but we did our best. And sorry, I missed the most important thing. Samantha Cameron, David's wife, and she really her great gift to David, apart from having a very happy marriage, which is so supportive emotionally in itself, was that they didn't make a ton of new celebrity friends at Number 10. They really did have their friends around. You know, they cooked upstairs and saw their friends when they could, not always, but when they could, they kept in touch with their friends.
What was the impact of him losing his son and losing his father in fairly quick succession? How did that change him? And can you talk about those?
It was, I mean, really devastating. And the Ivan, who was born as a very sick child. I mean, this is a child who never sat up and was fed through his stomach in a tube, but was a sort of beautiful child, and David loved so much, was taken from David and Samantha when he was 6 years old, and they spent so much time protecting him. He used to have fits that were always, you know, that always had to keep in check. And David, I think, was hugely affected by Ivan, had a huge sense of understanding of people who were weak and vulnerable, and a huge respect for the NHS, where he'd spent so much time. And when Ivan died right at the end of his time in opposition, I think it was terrible for him, because also opposition is so much a one-man show. It is so centered on the head of the party, and you know, his heart was just in a terrible way. And then he became prime minister quite shortly afterwards, and then lost his dad, who he really adored. And you know, Anthony, what was I really remember noticing is that 2012, the summer of the Olympics, he was really down that summer, and I think it was a sort of, in a way, it caught up with him. He kept on going, and then he had another low later about those events.
Did you see parallels? This is Yuri saying, between the COVID-19 food queues and the food queues under Russian communism.
Well, it's very funny. Yuri, is he from Russia, Yuri?
I think Yuri must be. I can't ask him.
I love that you said that, because that is so much what I've been feeling. I see the queues outside the stores. I mean, it's not the same in the sense that, but that thing was such a memory from my childhood, especially the babushka waiting in the queue, because of course the grandmother would go and wait in the queue, and that her children would go out to work. So it really did bring back memories.
And final question from Elizabeth: do you think that some of David Cameron's best policies risk being forgotten, such as all his work on international development with a 0.7%, with this week DFID being axed? And does that perturb him? What can you do as a prime minister when you see your successors undoing your work and indeed trashing you, as Theresa May did? What can you do as prime minister?
I think, look, it's very difficult when things you care about get unravelled by people that come later. And to your point, Elizabeth, also, you know, David started his leadership of the party saying he didn't want to bang on about Europe, and of course the irony is people remember him because of Europe. But I really hope that in the coming years, people will look back over the Cameron administration and remember it for its decency, and for you know, doing their best to restore, you know, the economic economy of our country, and for 0.7%, and for gay marriage, and for trying to create more good schools, and lots of good other things that we try to do. And sometimes it takes a bit of time. Sometimes the immediate aftermath is different. I mean, Anthony knows this as a historian, and the historians listening in. History changes and changes and changes, so we have to hope that it will improve later.
And a great question in from Max about a parallel between David Cameron losing his father and Baroness Thatcher, who was Chancellor at the university here, losing her own mental area. We're going to have to leave that one floating. Can I just mention, they were great questions, by the way. Thank you so much. I think we got through about 15 or even 20 then. Thank you so much for those. Next week, we have on Monday, Baroness Amos, the former government minister and Vice Chancellor, talking about, well, apart from everything else, Black Lives Matter. And then we have leading psychotherapist Julia Samuel, leading economist Paul Johnson, and leading philosopher Julian Baggini talking to us. That was a really, really wonderful talk, Kate. I don't think I've ever heard a talk that's given a better sense about what life is like in that unbelievably pressured place of Downing Street. And I don't think it would have been as effective. In fact, had we seen you in the flesh, that would have been very good. There are really interesting compensations from having online talks. Thank you, Kate Fall. This indeed is a book. I hope that all 1,000 of you will go out and buy a copy of Kate's book. It will make her and her publisher very happy. Kate is writing another book which is going to be about Russia. Maybe we can have you back, Kate, at another time in the future to talk about that. But Kate Fall, Baroness Kate Fall, thank you very, very much indeed for a truly wonderful talk. And thank you all of you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you all very much.